The global fight against ISIS continues, although President Obama doesn't seem fully on board. Federal officials now believe ISIS is sending an increasing number of militants to Libya, following reports late last year of several thousand taking refuge there. This increasing number perhaps due to the airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. Take a look.
The Pentagon estimates that around 5,000 jihadists have infiltrated Libya. While the number is prompting concern from federal officials, other intelligence sources suspect that number could be less. Despite the discrepancy, authorities say ISIS is developing a stronghold in Libya in addition to the terrorist group's control in Iraq and Syria. President Obama's national security advisors suggest deploying military options, including airstrikes, raids, and allocating troops to train Libyan militias without resorting to a boots-on-the-ground approach.
How do you fight without boots on the ground, without the commitment to defeating the enemy, without recognizing exactly who the enemy is and why they're the enemy? Joining me now to discuss the ongoing fight against ISIS is chairman of the Ullman Group and senior advisor at Washington, D.C.'s Atlantic Council, Harlan Ullman. Harlan, great to have you back.
Always good to be with you.
Harlan, Libya, you and I have discussed before the vacuum situation there. How serious of a concern is it that more ISIS fighters are taking hold there?
It's a very serious concern because I think the Islamic State is using the opportunity to expand as much as it can, to do so for several reasons. One, that will take a lot of attention away from Syria and Iraq. Two, there are opportunities to spread their wings and indeed to have a landing spot if things do not go as well as the Islamic State thinks they will in Iraq and Syria, and because it puts far more pressure on the alliance. As you know, the European countries have been deluged by refugees, which is far beyond their capacity to accommodate. And so by shifting to Libya, they're going to create more refugees. They're going to increase the pressure on Europe because Libya is that much closer. It's only on the bottom of the Mediterranean from Europe. And so for a number of tactical, strategic, and political reasons, from an Islamic State view, expanding, and they're using relatively small numbers of people, makes an awful lot of sense.
Right, and there have been reports that they're taking over Libya in the sense that they're levying taxes at gunpoint, they're building fortifications, they're building sanctuaries to perhaps attack North Africa and Europe. Is that who you expect them to target first?
No, I think that's an exaggeration. What they have done in Iraq and Syria, of course, is to take over chunks of land, and they've imposed a political situation and governance where they've been able to tax and do all sorts of things. The number of troops that they actually may have on the ground in Libya at this stage is more of an irritant than it is a formidable force that can take the country over. And it may well be they want to fight a guerrilla rear action to try to expand themselves. But I think there's absolutely no chance right now of the Islamic State being able to take over Libya. What they want to do is to get their roots in as deeply as possible. And if they're successful, possibly in a year, 2 years, maybe sooner, then they may be able to expand. But I think right now they want to survive, they want to get in. And if they really raise their heads up too high, they're going to get them cut off.
All right, now let me ask you about how to fight ISIS, especially in Libya, because there have been some discussions lately about President Obama's strategy, whether it's 20th century thinking versus 21st century warfare. You know, the propaganda war, ISIS is clearly winning. The guerrilla warfare, they're clearly winning in many senses. How do we fight ISIS in Libya?
Well, the place that you want to fight them is in Iraq. The fundamental problem that we have with our strategy is that we see the Islamic State as an existential threat to the region. And unfortunately, our allies in the region don't share that view. Saudi Arabia sees Iran and Assad of Syria as far greater threats. The Iraqis in Baghdad, the Baghdad government, sees the Sunnis as a bigger threat than the Islamic State and are more concerned about controlling the Sunnis than they are about ejecting the Islamic State from their territory. And the Turks are paranoid about the Kurds, the PKK, and also about Mr. Assad. So the first thing we have to do is to ensure that our coalition is indeed agreed on the centrality of the threat. We cannot want the Islamic State to be a bigger threat than is perceived by the region. And so I go back to basics. I would be really working very hard on the countries in the region to understand that this is really the threat that they have to face. And for the moment, I think Libya is eccentric. It's going to dilute our resources. I would also be talking with Russia and Iran because, face it, Russia, Iran, and the Kurds have got the most effective forces right now in Syria. And if we're going to do anything about the Islamic State, we have to use whatever resources are there, no matter how much we may dislike or distrust the Russians and Iran. So I would go back to square one, and I would look at Libya for the time being as an eccentric theater that's going to diminish our resources and our attention. And I think we have to get other countries to become engaged. But at this stage, I think Libya becomes a distraction rather than the principal axis of which to deal with the Islamic State.
Right, so essentially what you're saying then is even if we don't agree with Russia on anything else, the fact that we have this one common goal would be reason enough to join together and fight ISIS with them?
No, I wouldn't say it that way. I'd say it differently. I would say to Russia and Iran, if the Islamic State is indeed the enemy, which we think it should be, why are you not now turning your forces more directly against the Islamic State? And if you haven't done it yet, why aren't you doing it? I would put that in terms of a question to force them to answer that question in hopes that they'll be able to change their strategy. But we have to be careful. We cannot see ourselves allying directly with Russia and Iran because that will really hurt us with our other allies. We've got to be subtle, we've got to be tough, and we have to understand what we're doing. And quite frankly, right now, I think our policy is very much of a jumble.
Right, and speaking of subtlety and toughness, two things I wouldn't describe President Obama as. Reports are saying he hasn't decided how to handle this situation, whether it's Libya or obviously the Middle East. What do you expect him to do about it?
I hope he does the minimum. First of all, the problem in Libya, you have to go back nearly 5 years when we intervened. I should say when Britain and France intervened, and we came in from behind. NATO nations put in place airstrikes that ultimately drove Gaddafi from power and led to the civil war. We didn't know what we were doing. We used the right to protect on the basis that there was going to be humanitarian slaughter, and there wasn't one. And having gone in, we weren't prepared to stay the course. Now, if we're going to take action in Libya, the question is to do what? Is it to deal with the Islamic State? Is it to deal with a humanitarian situation where you want to bring in supplies? Is it trying to stabilize the country and nation build? So the first thing we have to define is what is the purpose of using military force and what do we think is a reasonable outcome? Unless or until we become satisfied with the answers to those questions, even considering the prospect of going in, it seems to me, would be a fool's errand. We learned that in Afghanistan, and we certainly have learned that in Iraq.
Right, and realistically, I doubt anything is going to change between now and next November, maybe next January, till we get some new leadership in there that recognizes the threat in a whole different way.
It might.
It might?
No, it may well change dramatically. You bet it may. There are so many uncertainties here. For example, if the Islamic State is to make a move against Saudi Arabia, which they could, that will change everything dramatically. If Iran is prepared to become more interested in rejoining the international community, that will change things. Right now, you will have seen that the Saudis have said they might be interested in sending forces to Syria. Well, that may not be a good thing because the forces they may want to send may be out to destroy the opposition that's basically on our side. And so we have to be very careful. But what's happening right now in the Middle East is unbelievably volatile. Things could change in a heartbeat. And which way they change, who knows? But you could see a fundamental realignment for reasons we can't predict right now. So I would say this is not going to be a secure situation between now and the next presidency. And when the next president comes in, by the way, a year hence, it's going to take between 6 months and a year for that administration to get its people in place, to get its policies in place. We just can't withstand free fall for another year and a half.
All right, Harlan, I appreciate your insight on this topic, and thanks for coming on the show again. I'll talk to you again soon.